Okay, everybody. We'll just start if everybody's ready. I think we have as many people as we're going to have at this stage, and I hope you're all nice and relaxed after lunch and ready for another exciting session. Now, this is one of my areas, so I find this very exciting anyways, and particularly with the people we have in front of us here today, we've a lot of policy experience. And when you think about it, in terms of the agricultural land base of the country, it covers 64% of the land base. If you add in forestry, farmers and landowners managing our forest estates essentially manage 75% of the area of the country. So it's vitally important how this land base is managed, both for our food production, our environment, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the environment in which we live. So I think in terms of agriculture policy, it's central to a lot of what we've been talking about today. In terms of how we're going to work this session, we'll have the Slido going. There's a poll on Slido as well, so that you can register your suggestions for improvement in CAP post 2020 as we go along as statements. But also you can ask questions through Slido as well. And if you like a question that's on Slido, please click it and vote for it, because the top 3 questions are the ones that are going to appear at the top of the screen when we open it up to the floor first, and these will be the questions that we'll have a chance of asking. But I will also give favour to the people that are in the hall here. We'll ask questions from the floor as well as using what will be on Slido. So keep an eye on the poll, but also register your questions throughout the session. In terms of the expertise we have in front of us today, this ranges from both national and EU level. We have Micheál Briain first, which will set us some context for us. He's the Deputy Head of the Nature Protection Unit in DG Environment. We have Andy Bleasdale, who will give the national perspective from the National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Scientific Unit. We've Keena, who's a specialist advisor specialising in biodiversity in Teagasc. We have Bill Callanan from the Department of Agriculture, who's the Chief Inspector, who will be one of the main architects, I think, of trying to actually moderate what goes into our CAP strategic plan and take all these suggestions on board. And then we have Flor McCarthy representing the farmers. He's the Hill Farm Committee chairperson. He's a farmer in Kerry, a sheep and beef farmer, but he has extensive experience at EU level on the Rural Development Civil Dialogue Group representing COPA, if I'm correct, Flor. So I think the people we have in front of us today, we can both see an EU perspective, a national perspective, a perspective from the advisory services, from the farmers on the ground, and also from the policymakers. And we put essentially 3 questions to the panelists before we start today, which will guide our discussion a bit. We want to, in this session, hear from both the EU and national experts about what has happened in the past, what's currently happened, but we really want to concentrate on the future and what we can do to improve the situation into the future, to address some of the challenges we've been hearing about in the rest of the conference. So the main questions we have are: how is biodiversity currently dealt with in agricultural policy? Have we made progress towards our target 3 in our EU Biodiversity Strategy, which is basically to demonstrate measurable improvements in farmland biodiversity across the EU? And knowing then what we know from that situation in terms of our baseline, what room is there for improvement in the Common Agricultural Policy post-2020? Now, we must realise that this policy is being formulated both at EU level and national level at the moment. It's a bit of a moving feast in terms of the regulatory framework we're going to be working within over the next 12 to 15 months. But I think it would be nice at this stage just to get an opportunity and discuss where we're at and what is the potential within for biodiversity and agriculture policy. So I'd first like to ask Micheál Briain maybe to set the scene for the EU perspective.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great pleasure to be back in Dublin, back in my hometown, and to participate in this very, very important event. I have a very strong sense of positivity that is being conveyed this morning in relation to the interest, the motivation of so many people working for biodiversity, and including in relation to what we heard before lunchtime in the session on farmers' engagement, and I think that was hugely significant to demonstrate that there are many, many positive stories. I'd like to, in relation to the three questions that James has framed, just to give a little bit of context for the debate. And maybe if I start with the question of the status of biodiversity that's linked to agricultural systems in the European Union. Because one thing that we can say is we've greatly improved our knowledge of biodiversity over the past 20 years. It's been driven by various initiatives under the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive, the EU Biodiversity Strategy. So we're in a much better position today in terms of the knowledge base to make judgments and assessments in relation to the health of nature. And unfortunately, if you look at the most recent assessments, the one on the right shows in relation to habitats and species that are protected under the Habitats Directive, the overall health of agricultural systems is very poor. And it's probably worse than most, if not all, other systems that have been looked at. That only 11% of the assessments that have been made are positive. And if you look at even the declining status of assessments that are continuing up to the period that was last recorded, this is from 2015. As Kieran mentioned this morning, we have another assessment which is forthcoming, and that will be the assessment that will be hopefully published by the European Commission next year on the basis of the national reports. The best knowledge we have is on birds, and if you see, even going back to the 1990s when the baseline was set at 100, you can see that there is a continuing decline of birds that are dependent on farmland systems. And more recently, we've actually started to look at other species, and the butterfly index is the one that has a wide use across Europe, and that shows a similar trend. Now, these are just three different sources of information. Many of you will be aware that there was a publication in the last weeks in Biological Conservation, which shows of the great collapse of insect populations globally, but also in particular in Europe. And that's linked to farming systems in particular. Intensification of agriculture, land use changes, and the use of chemicals. Now, I don't want to start in a totally negative way, because there are many, many positives. And in relation to our policy, agriculture biodiversity, there are very many targeted measures that have actually been started, particularly under the current policy, but there's been an evolution more in the agriculture policy to recognize that agriculture has a multifunctional purpose. Its primary purpose is to produce food, and that is a market value that obviously will have primacy. But there are other duties in relation to agriculture and expectations of society, including in relation to environmental quality. And if we look based on our assessments, there is a huge investment of funds that is going into biodiversity-related measures under the Common Agriculture Policy. Not only under rural development and agri-environment schemes under the second pillar, but also under the first pillar in relation to measures of cross-compliance and also in relation to the various greening measures that have been provided. Now, rural development policy, which is the one that gives us the agri-environment measures, is the most significant measure that we have across the European Union for the conservation of Natura 2000, these protected areas in the land area of Europe. So agriculture and nature go hand in hand in terms of the significance of EU policy. We also have found in the recent years that there's an increasing recognition at the European level in relation to the importance of agriculture systems and the link between that and water quality and air quality. And also, most recently, there's been great recognition of the role of chemicals and pollination and the risks to pollinators from certain practices in agriculture and the need to address that. I welcome the fact that Ireland has already taken a lead on this in relation to its pollination and pollinators initiative, and of course we have an initiative at European level. We also have some wonderful examples which I've seen today and I've known from the past in relation to the Burn Life project and the inspiration that has given to various other follow-up initiatives. I've seen more recently the Iron Life project. We've seen these European innovation partnerships, including the Bride project. So there's a huge basis of growing experience in Ireland as to how to work with farmers, for farmers, and for nature in ways that deliver these public goods that I think society increasingly demands. And I think this is really important, and Ireland is taking a lead in the whole area of result-based payment schemes. Of course, these are pilot schemes, and the critical thing will be what happens next in relation to building upon those experiences. But the overall conclusion that we have to take today is that the actions, while there are many positive actions taking place, are not sufficient, nor are they taking place at a sufficient scale, and that the drivers and pressures for biodiversity loss in agricultural systems are continuing. That's the challenge we have, and it's obviously a critical one if we are going to succeed in our biodiversity goals. I'd like to just say a few words. I could spend hours talking about this slide, but three critical elements of this slide is that there is a new proposal from the European Commission for the next round of the Common Agriculture Policy starting in 2021. And the new architecture provides many opportunities in relation to enhancing biodiversity in farmland systems. Of course, there will be, if you look at the bottom, there will be what we call enhanced conditionality. That means that there are some fundamental standards, including standards linked to the nature directives, to the Water Framework Directive, to the Nitrates Directive. These are what we call statutory management requirements that will need to be embedded in the future policy. Good agriculture and environment conditions will also need to be framed and respected. And of course, that is a bottom baseline that we need to ensure to have quality standards. There will also be in the proposal a provision under the second pillar, the Rural Development Policy, which commits to environment and climate targeted measures. And 30% of the second pillar, the Rural Development Policy, will have to go to dedicated measures that actually are for benefit to the environment and to climate. And this is very significant. And non-direct measures, and for example, areas of natural constraints, the Commission proposal doesn't include them in the 30%. This is subject to debate in Council, but we've believed that that money should be used for targeted measures to benefit nature and to address the climate agenda. There are many other measures, but I would only want to highlight in particular the innovation that we propose in the first pillar, and that is that there would be a new mechanism called eco-schemes that would be set up, and these would again have to provide benefits for environment and for climate. They would be very attractive measures because they would involve 100% co-financing. They would obviously be judged on an annual basis. We would be expecting that they would provide real benefits in relation to landscape management, in relation to organic farming, in relation to result-based payments and other initiatives. They will be mandatory on the member states, but they will be voluntary on the farmers. And of course, the challenge will be to design schemes that are going to be attractive and have good uptake. So that is the architecture. We can come back to this in the discussion in relation to how the opportunities may present. But before I conclude, I would just want to say that, of course, it's a fundamental that any way forward has to be a win-win situation that makes economic sense to farmers and that also provides gains in relation to the environment. So we have to design solutions that are viable in the context of the socio-economics of farming. All of this will be brought together for the first time in what we call CAP strategic plans. Ireland will have to submit, as do all member states, one plan that will set out in relation to those three different provisions an overall joined-up strategy in relation to what it wants to achieve for the next period. And our expectation will be that these are ambitious plans and that they will be fully compliant with Ireland's duties and commitments in relation to environmental legislation and, of course, in relation to climate policy. We already, in the context of the debate on the nature legislation and Natura, we've asked Ireland and the other countries to set out their funding priorities, their investment priorities for the next 7 years, to define what they need to do and to indicate what are the most important and urgent measures that need to be addressed in that. And that strategy, which not only applies to Natura, but applies to green infrastructure beyond Natura, will be a critical element in forming the development of the CAP strategic plans. And we would have an expectation that the CAP strategic plans, which will be led by the agricultural colleagues, will be developed in close partnership with the environmental authorities, so that we have a joined up policy. In relation to the eco-schemes, there is a debate about the eco-schemes taking place in the Council with a view to what the final package will be agreed. But we would also ask the Member States to have ambition there in relation to biodiversity. That clearly there are some opportunities. Organic farming is one area, chemical-free farming in relation to actually developments, and this is an area of growth in Europe. Restoring landscape features, all of these things, including result-based payments, building on the experience. I mean, I would love to see that the Bride project, the experience from that, could be upscaled and translated to something in the context of an eco-scheme that would be taken up more generally across Ireland. We have to ensure that in relation to this debate that we are having in this conference, that nature's benefits, the services that we're getting from healthy nature in a farmland system, like for example in relation to pollinators, that is embedded more in the next agriculture policy. And I know there's huge pressure on countries like Ireland to address the climate agenda, and that is urgent, and 40% of the CAP will have to be seen to be going for climate measures. But I don't think that the climate agenda should be seen to be separate from the biodiversity agenda. In fact, they are one and the same agenda. And of course, we have to look at in relation to elements of crops that will be grown and how agriculture will adapt in terms of forestry and other things. But climate adaptation and climate mitigation, nature provides many of those solutions. And I would hope that in the Irish approach towards climate adaptation and mitigation, that this would actually be factored in, that it's not a separate agenda. And finally, of course, critical that we have good advisory services. What I've taken from my experience in looking at the Irish projects of implementation, that the success that you see in the Burn, on Aran Islands, in the Bride project, are based on committed farmers, visionary farmers, that have good ecological advisors working with them. And if you don't have a good advice and support from the people that the farmers trust most, we're not going to make progress. So that's going to be really important. And of course, this has to be adapted to the local situations. And finally, all of this will have to be underpinned by credible and transparent monitoring systems. There is a debate about the different indicators that we would use to measure the performance in relation to agriculture. But unless there's transparency, we talk about more subsidiarity, we talk about more flexibility, but we're also talking about a policy that delivers results. And I think we need to make sure that we have the indicators, that we can measure progress, and we can make adjustments as needed. Thank you.
I think that was a great opening to set the scene. We can see that there is, at this stage in the debate in Europe, there's opportunities to do quite an amount in the potential CAP post-2020. But also, it presents a lot of challenges for member states, and particularly now with subsidiarity, member states will get back control. So what we do with that control and how we utilise that control will be dependent on people like Andy and Bill. So maybe Andy can outline first where we're at in terms of this, and then maybe we move on to Bill.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks, Micheál. It's great to hear the Commission view in an Irish accent. I think it always helps translate the European policy into an Irish reality. Just to say before I kick off, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. A lot of work has gone on behind the scenes to make this event happen, and it's great to be surrounded by this positivity where biodiversity is put to the front and the centre. The people on the panel, I guess, are all fellow travellers on the world of the intersection between agriculture policy and biodiversity policy. And we have worked together in the past, and I guess we need to continue to work together into the future. We need to do so to improve management of biodiversity on the ground in the context of how that intersects with farming. I don't think any of us always have the same and ultimate aligned view. I think our views differ, and I think that's healthy and normal and to be expected. I think it's just how we work out those differences to make sure that what we're doing collectively has an effect on the ground that is positive for biodiversity. It's not about being right or wrong. I don't think the Department of Agriculture would claim to be always right, or MPWS would claim to be always right, and any other stakeholder here would claim to have a monopoly on the truth. We all have our own views on the world, but I think we need to collectively work together to make sure that in the end biodiversity is protected. And our report card will be the evaluation of the habitats and species in Ireland. It will be an example, or the truth will be in that reality. If we're not working well together, we're not protecting these habitats and species on the ground, and therefore we have failed despite our best efforts. So the challenge is there to work proactively well together, to overcome any obstacles that we face interpersonally or across organisations, to work openly and to build trust collectively together. And I think that would be true of anyone else's view at this table as well. So my presentation today is to say a bit more on what Micheál has already said from a national perspective, from an MPWS perspective. I'll give it a bit of warts and all, without pointing fingers at anyone in particular. We're all responsible ultimately. So looking at some of the bad news, some of the things that haven't worked well, and also looking at some of the good news and some of the things that have worked well, and then some opportunities to build on that into the next CAP period. So that's my intention. So the challenges then, and this is the challenge that faces biodiversity more generally, not just in the farming world. It's that biodiversity of itself is not a sector. MPWS isn't in charge of biodiversity. Biodiversity isn't a sector driving forward in the way that transport drives forward, or the Department of Agriculture drives forward, or agriculture as a sector drives forward. Biodiversity cross-cuts everything else, so therefore we need biodiversity to be embedded in everything else for that to be protected. So managing biodiversity broadly across different sectoral approaches is always going to be challenging. MPWS is a competent authority with respect to biodiversity, but there are lots of other agencies and actors and stakeholders involved. In many cases, we are not the management authority or the regulatory authority, and in some cases, we're not even the paying agency. So while we might have a very strong invested view in the context of biodiversity, we are not the delivery mechanism necessarily of how biodiversity is to be rolled out on the ground and protected. So therefore, policy oftentimes is not always sufficiently, and maybe sufficiently should be in there, sufficiently biodiversity focused. It sometimes can be an afterthought, or can sometimes be folded in after the fact once other sectoral interests have been advanced. And I think that's a challenge that will face us indefinitely and not just into the next cycle. The threats and pressures in Natura 2000 are many, and in the wider landscape that holds biodiversity, and these are changing and increasing in a daily way. And new threats and pressures are coming to the fore as well. We've already discussed climate change already today, nitrogen deposition, ammonia pressures outside but affecting Natura 2000 or affecting biodiversity are new concepts to be addressed and to be managed if we are to protect and manage biodiversity. And it's a truism to say that funding and capacity, not just within MPWS but within other government departments and in other stakeholders, is limited in the space of being able to provide the funding or the advice in relation to biodiversity that we know needs to happen. So there are some of the challenges. Getting a bit more grim for a minute before I get really happy and clappy. Our Article 12 and Article 17 assessments for the last cycle in 2013 showed a very negative interaction between farming, nature and biodiversity, in that many of our farmed habitats were in poor state and the species in those habitats were not doing well. And I'm afraid the news won't be much better this time around as we report out in 2019 under Article 17 and Article 12. In fact, it will be worse. So therefore, one can only conclude from that land management is not currently delivering to the extent that it needs to for many habitats and species in Ireland, and particularly for farmed habitats and species. And in fact, some species are at critically low levels. You can think of the curlew, corncrake, hen harrier, a whole suite of species that depend on sustainable, extensive farming being delivered at landscape level. And when that goes somehow wrong, then those species will suffer, and they'll be the first indicator of a beginning of a failure in those systems. So with that in mind, one can only then conclude that payments to farmers in some of these priority areas for biodiversity have not been successful in addressing these threats and pressures or limiting these declines. And the question has to be asked, if you were looking at this coldly, can we justify to continue to make payments in that space if we're not delivering results? So I think that talks very much to Micheál's point that we need, all of us at this top table here and all of you on the ground, need to ensure that the payments that we're making to the farming community through agri-environmental payments under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are actually improving the situation for biodiversity at farm level. That's going to be a challenge in the years ahead. And Micheál, while he's very nice and very pleasant and a great guy to meet and discuss, there's also a reasoned opinion against Ireland that has come from the Commission that points a critical finger at how we've been doing our business in Ireland, that is completely accepted, one has to say, from MPWS, that there are critiques to be made and improvements to be made. So there's a formal, while we can talk informally, there's also a formal mechanism when we're taken to task nationally, and not just MPWS, but Ireland needs to respond to this reasoned opinion to address these threats and challenges in the years ahead. So there's a formal case against Ireland that needs to be responded to. So that was the bad news. So that's half of my presentation. Now moving on to the good news. So all of the good news stories that we've already been referenced, that have been referenced today, the Burn programme is a beacon of success that's shining the light forward for every other project in Ireland, showing a way that is positive, that builds trust, and that delivers results on the ground. And I think other LIFE projects are taking inspiration from that. I know from my involvement in the Iron Life project that they're very much trying to build on that success in a different landscape, and now bringing that success from Iron Life in the LIFE phase into an EIP phase as well, funded by the Department of Agriculture. So they're all very, very positive things. The RBAPS project that Dolores Byrne was speaking about earlier on in the session just before lunch, showing how one can trial and test incentivising payments to farmers to get them to understand what society wants and they are paid accordingly for that delivery mechanism. So that's all really positive. A species that I've mentioned already as being a species suffering serious declines, National Parks and Wildlife Service are funding a conservation programme to try and stymie and address that threat to that species by proactively engaging with the farming community and a whole range of other stakeholders to improve the lot for curlew in the landscape. And that is challenging, both within and without Natura 2000. And then cross-border projects like Interreg 5A, the Callanan, the CAB projects, and I know some people from those projects are here today, working across border, learning from what they're doing in the north learning from what we're doing in the south, habitats that occur across borders, species that move across borders. How do you actually, in the Brexit space, work with partners across jurisdictions to manage biodiversity that is necessary if we're to manage those habitats and species? And then the biggest success of them all, to my mind, and this is where major kudos needs to go to the Department of Agriculture, the European Innovation Programmes funded by the Department of Agriculture and obviously via EU funding, are really showing a way forward for locally led, results-based ideas being developed, almost decoupled and devolved from the Department of Agriculture and from MPWS, worked out locally, and hopefully the knowledge garnered through that process will be stitched back in then into the next RDP period and beyond, as suggested already by Micheál. So, as Micheál has said, we are doing a lot. We're doing a lot of under-the-bonnet work across departments to work out what it is required at local level and to incentivise results-based delivery models. But the challenge for us all is to how to apply that at a landscape level across Ireland in the years ahead. So we're building capacity through these projects, through LIFE, through IPs, through Interreg. Understanding is improving across departments and between departments and across other agencies. Trust is being developed in those projects between National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Department of Agriculture, farmers, Teagasc, the EPA, the NGOs, both farming and non-farming, ENGOs, and other agencies, all working together on projects, rolling up their sleeves, getting stuck in, delivering positive outcomes, and actually learning by doing, and learning when to concede the point or the high moral ground, which is also important in projects like that. And success and excellence is being recognised in projects like we've already referenced this morning in the Farming for Nature Awards and the awards funded through this biodiversity conference administered by the Irish Wildlife Trust These are all really, really positive things to showcase particular farmers or particular groups that are doing positive things for nature, to encourage others to do similar things in their communities. So there's an energy and an appetite for change, not just in the room today or and at this conference, but more broadly. And this does demand effort and energy of people to continue to roll up the sleeves and get stuck in, but there is no alternative. I think we're all impassioned and inspired by the challenge of actually trying to address some of these really serious challenges in the years ahead, using whatever funding instruments are available to us, including the CAP. Okay, the opportunities then. This is my final slide, James. Just to let you know that the PAF, as mentioned by Micheál, is an opportunity to show the way forward in the next reporting period, or the next operating period, in fact, for the next 7 years. So that should determine the needs of Natura, and I think the Department of Agriculture should pay close attention to that document and will be party to the drafting of that document as well, which will then inform the CAP strategic plan. So those two documents will be very positive if they are to be successful in the years ahead. And the time for action is now in the context of the PAF and in the context of the CAP strategic plan. Both of these things will begin to happen in a major way in the coming weeks and months, I think. Certainly by the end of 2019, the way forward should be defined by those two documents. And one would also hope that the Department of Agriculture are looking at what's coming through the IPs and folding that into the CAP strategic plan and the plans for the next period. And as Micheál has already said, he's echoing some of the points I was hoping to make, and it's no harm that more than one would say it, that the results-based idea needs to be embedded into the next CAP period as well, to encourage and incentivise farmers to respond to the market forces of being paid for the delivery of something that society actually wants to happen. And if we can do that for biodiversity, there'll be win-wins for other sectors as well, or for other issues like climate change, like water management, and more broadly for agriculture and farmers who deliver nature in that environment. And if all that goes swimmingly, then the funding and the capacity to deliver for nature will be enhanced in the years ahead. Listen, thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.
So we'll just get Bill to actually outline the situation in the Department of Agriculture currently.
Thank you very much, James. As per the introduction, my name is Bill Callanan. I'm head of the environmental policy in the department, and I suppose in terms of the context of the next CAP, I suppose I bridge what is the objectives and the ambitions and what we're hearing from the likes of the state of Irish agriculture and the environment, from the EPA, from the likes of the PAF, etc., and how that fits into policy development. There's a lot of colleagues here from the department here, and our predominant objective is really to listen. We have colleagues like Colin Hayes, who has responsibility for forestry and implementation of schemes. We have a number of people from rural development, etc. also. So the objective is really much a listening exercise. But I suppose I want to give you an overview really of where the thinking is. And I suppose it's been a really informative morning, and I was reflecting on some of those. I'll go to the presentation very quickly, but actually more importantly is to give you a sense of what are the key messages, what are the I suppose drivers for us in terms of the agriculture field. And firstly is, I suppose, from a connection with biodiversity, farmers manage 60% plus of land base. So it's critically embedded in terms of the biodiversity piece. But I suppose my first message to everybody here is that, sustainability is becoming a really critical issue in terms of the agricultural story. And that's not just from a regulatory driver point of view, and Micheál identified some of that, but also from a market driver. The consumer today is looking for clear sustainability messages in terms of food production, and therefore it becomes mainstreamed in terms of agriculture rather than a compliance issue. And there is a hierarchy in terms of world food production, where first of all availability of food is critical. The reality of 900 million people that are malnourished every day and a further similar amount undernourished is something we cannot abdicate as a world food producing issue. After that then, food safety becomes critical for everybody. And we take it for granted in the likes of developed countries, but it is not universal worldwide. And increasingly then, sustainability becomes part of our commitment. So we deliver on those multiple objectives. Sustainability, for example, in Food-Wise is the overarching chapter in relation to that. So the message for me is that this is mainstream and not just secondary. The second thing is, I suppose, from a cornerstone of agricultural policy, we really are keyed into this. It's really about evolution. And if I describe the evolution in terms of our, I suppose, investment in CAP, an earlier presentation that was done this morning identified the likes of a REP scheme, which was very broad and shallow, and that's now evolved into what was the AOS scheme, which was around targeted actions, and now GLOS, which is targeted actions at specific locations. So there's a natural evolution occurring in relation to the increased targeting of investment being done by the Common Agriculture Policy and the Department of Agriculture in this space, because very much nowadays it is based on results. That's not always easy to achieve, because I caution always in terms of effort does not always translate into impact in relation to the environment, but certainly we're on that journey. I suppose in terms of the development of CAP as well, people have to recognise there are multiple demands. Yes, I have responsibility for climate, for biodiversity and water, and a lot of times they converge, but the target audience sometimes when you have a limited resource often is different in terms of how you approach things. So, you know, clearly we are 44% of emissions in Irish non-ETS sector in relation to climate, so it has to form an increased part of the next Common Agricultural Policy. And equally so, what you're looking for there is additionality in relation to it. It's fine to say, you know, within our peatlands we have a significant repository of carbon, and that's important to retain and to maintain, but equally so when you have to contribute to closing the gap, you have to look for additionality, and that would be our focus. Finally, just a word of caution as a message, and I'll go through the presentation then, is do not divorce the environment from farming and food production. They are intertwined, and you know, when we're dependent on farmers in terms of voluntary, I suppose, signing up to schemes, etc., you know, there's a professional pride in terms of food production that underpins a vitality needed in terms of overall agriculture that enables biodiversity to be embedded in terms of that. And from me, in terms of policy drivers, it's quite simple. There are regulatory ways of doing it, there's incentivization, and there's also importance of capitalizing on that market pull from consumers in terms of what they expect. And I suppose the reality of agriculture into the future is that it does need that moral approval of general society in terms of whether it's animal welfare, whether it's our environmental credentials, etc. And that's very much built into our thinking. So just on some of the numbers in terms of what's been achieved to date, I know Andy put up some successes, but I think this was missing, which is the GLOS scheme. And as I indicated, it's very much a targeted. It's quite different to what went before. If you look at it, we're using EPA mapping in relation to high status water to prioritise applicants in terms of entry to the likes of a scheme like this. We use MPWS maps equally in terms of Natura. And I would not dismiss the impact that 50,000 farmers' involvement in an agri-environmental scheme can achieve, because it's certainly not broad and shallow, because they're quite prescriptive, and no longer can somebody just pick what they want to do. If you're within an area which has been identified as a priority, for example, a water or biodiversity, you must comply with the prescriptions that are pertinent to that particular objective. So by way of examples, we have over 6,000 farmers who are involved in the scheme with prescriptions in relation to bird habitats, be that twite, that was mentioned, curlew, grey partridge, hen harrier, etc. And these are all prescriptions that, you know, we just haven't designed alone, but have involved the likes of NGOs, etc., in relation to the development of those prescriptions, so that it's the right measure in the right place. We've over 120,000 hectares of private natural lands involved, are supported under the scheme, which is a significant support in terms of achievement of the Natura network. Competing for the third most common cereal grown in the country is the preparation, or the 20,000 hectares of wild bird cover. Our oats in the country is give or take around that sort of hectarage as well. So it really shows kind of the volume of investment that's been put into specific actions and the development of targeted measures, because it is right, it's all about what's delivered at the end of the day. In relation to the European innovation partnerships, clearly this is, it wasn't mentioned earlier on, let's say in a presentation, but this is an evolution. Effectively what happens is you have development of a life project, which then translates into a pilot type project, which was the early days of the Burn, which then translates into a much larger scheme, which the Burn is now, which influences the policy development in agri-environment, which is the EIP. And we have 22 of these, 25 million being invested in a hen harrier project, ambition of approximately 1,200 farmers to be committed to that. Pearl mussel, 10 million. These are not things alone that the department is coming up with, but rather in conjunction with MPWS, in conjunction with NGOs, in conjunction with other stakeholders, identifying where the investment needs to be best placed. Some examples, we have the uplands in terms of the Black Stairs, the Inishowen, Connemara. We also have projects, it's very, very hard to read it, I think there, in terms of organic farming. Also, another one I want to draw attention to is on the next, protecting farmland pollinators from a water quality point of view, the Allo project. From a heritage point of view, the Rackcrohan project. And these are bottom-up approaches where effectively individuals involved. The process was an open call twice by the department for proposals. The best of those, the 40 best, were given money to go off and develop those. And then from that, 22 were selected for support. So it's quite a competitive process with clear objectives. And it really engages people. But let's be honest about it as well, there's a much higher overhead in terms of the operation of this. And within a fixed volume of money, you do have to get a balance between broad and very detailed implementation. The Burn, as I said from the outset, the department has been supporting this. We're now at 329. It won a European-wide life award in relation to it, so I think we're very much at the cutting edge. That's pretty much my objective, but I suppose my key messages are that sustainability is mainstream. There are multiple objectives. We need to work with farmers. We need to have it in a language that we can understand. From our perspective in terms of implementation of CAP going forward, you have to remember these are voluntary schemes. The Welsh, a number of years ago, launched an extremely ambitious last year, and they didn't get the level of participation that was required and had to go back and redraft. So there's a natural balance in terms of the engagement with farmers in relation to commitment here. But our overall objective of participation in the likes of today, etc., is listening in terms of the development of policy and the next CAP, etc. And it's important that everybody here makes their voice heard in terms of that debate, and we're very open and transparent in relation to how the process will work out.
So at this stage, we've heard from the EU level and the national level, but a lot of the implementation and the interaction between biodiversity and agriculture occurs at ground level. So maybe if we could get maybe Catherine to respond first from the advisory services side.
Hello, my name is Catherine Keena. I work with Teagasc, Countryside Management Specialist, so working on biodiversity and agri-environment schemes for the last a long time, 20 odd years in this job, but previously on the ground in Cavan, so I've seen a good bit of the country. I'm going to share 6 facts with you that they're provisional results from my PhD research from 149 dairy farmers in Waterford, which I think will give some insight to the question that James asked us as to how biodiversity is dealt with in agricultural policy. So this is very much the farmers' view, which we've heard already this morning is very important, how they see it if we want to change practice. So number one, I suppose, as I think Ella and a few mentioned this morning, the confusion, there is a lack of understanding of both the word and what to do. I found the importance of water quality is clearly understood by the farmers. I suppose that's testament to the work we've done over the last number of years, and I'm not saying we have it right, but there was no issue about the fact that it's important and we must keep it right. But biodiversity, there was confusion. The second point I think that's important, especially with the intensive agriculture sector, I use the Irish phrase, an rud is anmh is ionach, what is rare is wonderful, and the opposite then, that the common is not recognised. So farmers did not recognise as much the value to biodiversity of common habitats, hedgerows, field margins, watercourses. If there was a bog or something, the wild bird cover, they straight away mentioned it. You know, they recognised that was because it's probably got a lot of publicity or whatever. Number 3, very important and a bright light for the future, 97% of these dairy farmers would like to see wildlife coexisting with farming on their farms. But improving habitats for wildlife is not a priority for them. So I think the 2 facts are very important. They're busy people, we all understand that, lots of pressure, the will is there, but not a priority. Number 4, moving into the specifics, farmers would prefer to own tall, dense hedgerows trimmed to a triangular profile with occasional trees, what we would deem to be good for biodiversity, although on half the farms, the majority of their hedgerows were flat-topped and less than 1.5 metres. And we know from the science that a hedgerow of less than 1.5 metres, no bird will nest in it. They have the sense not to. So there's a mixed match there. But again, it's good news that they would like what? It's just, again, not a priority. Habit, I've gone into all the reasons. I'm not going to go into detail today. Number 5, moving on to the policy side of it, farmers recognised from what I showed them pictures of unfarmed areas as having a value to wildlife, but they also consider them to be a waste of land, because that's what the policy is telling them at the moment. Number 6, the average field size on these farms, 140 dairy farmers in Waterford. Now I'm talking about the average, not their smallest and biggest. They all have a range, but the average field size was 5 hectares. But that varied from 1 hectare to 37 hectares. So one farmer, the average of his field sizes was 1 hectare. So picture that landscape, and then the other landscape had his dairy prairie landscape, and those 2 farmers are being valued equally at present. So I think that's all recognised equally. So the positives, I suppose, for the future, which is what James asked us to look for, is that farmers are willing, if we could get the policy right, and I acknowledge it's not always easy to do that. Another very positive thing, a lot of people here know me as a lone voice on biodiversity, or one of the lone voices in Teagasc on biodiversity, but we are extremely fortunate in Ireland to have an army of people that are ready to act on biodiversity. And this army that I speak of is the Teagasc advisors and the private FÁS advisors, agricultural advisors. And we have proven this, that through the Briain, these are the people on the ground with extra training have become the agents for change, because they're the trusted people, as was said before. And we've now moved in with the Hen Harrier, first, I would suggest, very successful year in the same process. So engaging these people who are there on the ground, trained, well able to take the messages that need to be. It was only a few weeks ago with James at a HNV conference on high nature farming in France, speaking with other countries, I realised that a lot of countries don't have that army ready to go. Ready if the policy is right, if we can get it right. So I suppose a few of my suggestions for the policy to mainstream biodiversity in agricultural policy. One example would be including it as a mandatory topic in the KT groups. To me, this would mainstream the general advisors. It would mean that today, instead of going out talking about a breeding index or a grass measurement, or a new topic which is being thrown at them all the time, it would be biodiversity. And again, they would be well able to cope if time would be found. Again, it's not that they mind either, they're not negative, but it's time. There's 100 things to be done in their view as well. So I suppose I would just love to see it. Again, my research, like others, like Anya would have talked about before, is the importance of the agricultural advisor as the key person who will influence her as well as provide advice. So mainstream biodiversity, as much as we can, is what I would say. It's there, but it's not on the mainstream, I would suggest at the moment. Number 2, to support visionary farmers who are leaders in biodiversity. Again, Micheál always is the first visionary we think of. Farmers listen to farmers. And again, I'd like to mention the Donald Sheehan today. I mean, I've been talking about hedgerows for the last 20 years, and I would say I haven't got far, to be honest. People are aware, I've probably raised the awareness, but Donald has done more in the last 6 months because it's a farmer who's talking about hedgerows being important. So I totally recognise and would love to see how we can use that in the future to kind of push the likes of farmers who have, you know, who can lead the way, and how we can support them. And the third one then is just a couple of examples maybe of key measures that, again, this is more in the intensive farming area. Very, very simple. We've talked about pollinators. We need flowers. As you drive home this evening or on the train, you'll see lots of hedgerows that are trimmed, flat-topped back. Now, I know the likes of Donald wants them to grow up, and I totally appreciate that. I love those hedgerows on the farms that I found were like that. But for the ones that are routinely trimmed, if we could get every farmer to leave one whitethorn to grow up in that hedge. There are trees in the hedges, again, you'll see this evening as you look, but there's very, very few whitethorns. So, you know, very, very simple. Farmers all say that's a good idea. Practice, again, I've done work with contractors, 50% of the decisions are made by contractors. So we have a lot of work today, but if the policy was right, we'd be talking about it. That's the point. If not, if it's just another nice thing to do, it may not be done. Similarly, with the hedgerows, again, I mentioned the 1.5 metres. Surely we could insist, because I have tried and I haven't succeeded. We need to insist, the policy needs to insist on getting them higher. And again, the thirdly is to recognise the farmers with the lower field size. I think the landscape is terribly, terribly important in the intensively farmed areas. So they're just a few ideas. Thank you.
Yes. And maybe to get Flor's suggestions or thoughts now.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'm a farmer, and I'm an IFA representative for the last 20 years. Was a lobbyist, I'd call myself, and as farmers, we respond to incentives. That's what farming is about. We were like everybody else in this room. We was providing income. I farm with myself, my wife Mary, and 4 children, 2 of them in second level, 2 in secondary school. So there's 6 of us living off the farm. So income is obviously very important to us. And the cap, both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, I wouldn't be here today only for the schemes that are involved in both of these pillars. The retirement scheme probably was one of the main schemes that got me into farming, because I started with a very small land base. I own a lot of land now, but you know what I mean, I took advantage of the EU schemes, and all over the years. We see more than ever today how important the EU schemes are to us with Brexit. You know, we're already affecting people here mightn't realise I'm a beef and sheep farmer, beef being my main part of my income, and sheep being the secondary part, you know what I mean? But we beef prices about 30 cents a kilo less than we had this time 12 months. So we're selling our stock at about €200 a head less, which isn't profitable. The only reason it's profitable is because of EU funding. So I mean, we don't know what's going to happen on the 1st of April, but it will affect our incomes severely, and it already has over the present winter. So that is why when you talk about the EU schemes, we depend on them for our income. They're not schemes they have to take advantage of. They're providing income for us, a support income in the 3 sectors especially, both the tillage, the livestock and the sheep, because they're low profitability sectors and have been. And the issues I have is that, you know, not alone say the designations and all them, they affect our ability to farm the land. And obviously we need compensation for the designations, but it's not all about compensation. It's about being allowed to farm the land as well. And we all farmed, and the most important thing people here today must realise is that we must get young people to come into farming. and we must make it easy for them to be able to enter the industry. If we don't, we won't have another generation. We're definitely going to have less farmers, but the challenge for us as legislators or as lobbyists is to get as many young people as possible into farming. I see now my own son, he's in ag college. He looks at agriculture as a business, a way of making income. And if he can't see that as a viability, he's going to pursue another direction. So, I mean, there is challenges there, but definitely the designations affect us. And like what has happened in the Burden, people are allowed to farm the land in conjunction with the designation. That needs to be rolled out to the rest of the country. We need management plans for the designations. I farm a lot of designated land. I don't know what it's designated for, what the restrictions are. We need these management plans. We can't actually implement them if they actually aren't out there. But I want to stress, it isn't all about money. I mean, we actually need to be allowed farm as well, because, say, like in the Burden, they're allowed to put in tracks, they're allowed to manage their land. We're not allowed to do that in other parts of the country. And if we don't, the bigger hills will be left unfarmed, because people are working off farm. They need to be able to manage their farm enterprise quickly, efficiently, and that has to be done in conjunction with the designations. And that's where we need the MPWS to be proactive as well. As I said, obviously, the importance of Pillar 1 cannot be overstressed. And I mean, we obviously want Pillar 1 not to be over-restrictive, the environmental measures to be in Pillar 2. And as I said, as a farmer, I'm an environmentalist every day, and will be more so. But I look at the agricultural colleges, the two I'm familiar with are Clonakilty and Pallaskinnery. They are just learning us about dairying. A high percentage of students going through there will never go back to dairy farming because the farms are unsuitable. They're not blessed to have a 90-acre fields. We just don't have them. So I mean, my son will be going dairy farming in the morning as well if my farm was suitable. So I think our colleges, there needs to be movements made there to tailor the programs to suit the children that are actually coming through them colleges. And there needs to be biodiversity in these colleges. That's not happening. That needs to happen. And about the other issue then is the locally led schemes. They need to be mainstream. And I think Bill and our EU counterpart has said the same. Up to 30% of that funding is going outside of farming to advisors. I have nothing against advisors to get the schemes going. Obviously, it costs money, but if there's a high percentage of the money is going outside of farming, there's lots of areas where there is not farm employment. Some of the areas nearer to the higher centres of population, farming will survive way easier in these areas. The more remote areas where they aren't able to access second incomes, we're going to see massive declines in farming. That's the challenge for us, both here as a lobbyist, for myself, is to keep people in that land. And I feel that there is actually a move at the moment to move sucklers and sheep off the land for the CO2. But they don't realise what they're actually doing is, where the sucklers and sheep are, that land is not suitable for dairying. That's by its nature rougher land. And we actually need to support that stock, because we are going to face having large tracts of that countryside being abandoned, because actually people think, and was said here this morning, that if we get rid of so many sucklers, we can increase so many dairy cows. But the dairy cows are actually going on in the same areas. They're not going on. Donegal to West Cork is where the bulk of the sucklers are. Not necessarily all of them. We have them in Wicklow, we have them in other regions, but they tend to be on the poorer land regions. And if we see drastic reductions in these stocking levels, what we're seeing is land being left there. That's not in our interest as farmers, it's in no one's interest. And how the schemes are designed, whether they're farmed by a lot of smaller farmers or whether they're farmed by larger farmers who do it full time. These are the challenges I view for us going forward to keep the land of Ireland farmed. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
We started 5 minutes late. I just want to take 5 minutes just to review the Slido, what you've up on the Slido at the moment. If we could put up the Slido for a minute. So these are just some of the top questions. We haven't got time to go through them in detail because of the coffee break. But generally, farmers all across the country are currently removing rich habitat in order to make land eligible for farm payments. Isn't this situation highly contradictory? I suppose this question goes to the situation in terms of we've touched on earlier on, in terms of the contradiction between different pillars of the CAP, and what Catherine talked to about the confusion between farmers on the ground of what biodiversity is and what the actual policy is saying. Maybe Flor, could you respond to that and say the reason why farmers are removing habitats, or what message are they getting that actually sends them?
So in the better land areas, the land has been deemed ineligible, and that's the biggest challenge for me as a hill farmer as well, is to keep my land eligible for payments. I mean, if our land is deemed to be growing wild, it's taken out for the EU payments. But also, we had a problem, which I think the department have dealt with the new mapping system, where trees were casting shadows in the fields, and that land was being taken out. So that was the department wouldn't tell us to remove the trees, but I was giving incentive to the farmers to remove the trees. But with the new sensors now to have, it's supposedly coming down the middle of the hedge. Bill will be able to explain that to me. And so the trees won't be actually, but it's all about eligible ground. It's giving a signal.
So the farmers are essentially under one side of the pillar. 80% of their payments are coming for the amount of eligible land they have. And these areas that are being removed, that are seen as habitats, are not seen as eligible for these payments, even though they're eligible for Pillar 2 payments. But maybe Bill might respond more quickly to question 2 as well. Is it the Department of Agriculture's policy to bring as much land as humanely possible into intensive production?
No, absolutely not. If you look at it in terms of, at EU level, Michael would understand there's a stocking limit, which is effectively 2 dairy cows per hectare, which is I suppose, the maximum that can be farmed. And if you look at Ireland, there's huge swathes of our land. Over 60% of our land is farmed at a low level of intensity, at least half of that. In other words, less than 85 kilos of nitrogen. So we have a huge amount. We do have certain pockets of very intensively farmed land. If you look at our derogation farmers, that's a small cohort predominantly of dairy farmers. They're 5% of the farms, they have 20% of the livestock. But then, if you look up, let's say, all the western seaboard, as Flor has mentioned, in terms of livestock intensity, that's at really low levels. 83% of Sligo, Mayo, Leitrim, etc., is below that 50% of what the actual the limits are. So it's certainly not. It's about maximising, I suppose, the return from that land, and that for some land is environmental, for some land it's afforestation, for some land it is intensive production, and that's an evolving situation. But alongside intensification in some areas, I think Flor's point in terms of the risk of abandonment in other areas and having that as a negative for biodiversity needs to be recognised as well, and we need to avoid that. So there are competing challenges in relation to that.
That's the one thing we have to understand in relation to the CAP. It's a very confusing policy, and the reason it's confusing is it's a policy that has to deal with so many issues. It's the largest pot of money in the EU as well, and the big challenge is to try and get that policy signals correct, so that there's clear messages for the farmer on the ground for what needs to be delivered to meet societal challenges. So we'll just call it a day that we just put up the slide out, the poll, the answers to the poll. We leave it at that, and some of this debate can be continued on in the next session. I think it'll be more of an open debate, and I'll definitely raise some of these issues in that debate as well. So if we just see the slide up poll, and then we can, as food for thought before we go for coffee. The question was suggestions for improvement in the CAP post 2020. Now, I haven't seen this yet myself, but I'd just be interested to see in terms of the total number of suggestions. So we've a large number of suggestions there. I think the best thing we'll do is we'll maybe filter them and then we'll send them out. So the panel will go through these and we'll put them out there, okay? So we've a wide range of suggestions, and sorry we hadn't time to go through more, but we'll try and maybe keep this on in the debate further on in the day. So enjoy the coffee break.